So then I'll just switch the, yeah, go ahead. I took off the video. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, good evening, good afternoon, good morning, depending on where in the world you are. I am Joelle Richards, and I am with the permanent delegation of the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States here in Geneva. And it gives me great pleasure to bring this webinar session to order. We have a very exciting panel before us today, and I will certainly be introducing them in a very short while from now. I have sitting beside me my new ambassador in Geneva, who is no stranger to the Caribbean, Ambassador Colin Murdoch from Antigua and Barbuda. He is now the OECS Ambassador and Permanent Observer to the United Nations Office in Geneva, and also the Permanent Representative of Antigua and Barbuda to the World Trade Organization. And it is my understanding that he's already causing quite a stir in the city. Ambassador Murdoch, before I invite Alicia Nichols to give opening remarks on behalf of the Trinidad Ramphel Center, I'm just going to give you the floor to say a few words on behalf of the Geneva Mission and by extension, the OECS Commission.
Well, thank you very much, Joelle, and good afternoon, good evening to all colleagues and everyone tuned in. I'm a very recent arrival in Geneva, as Joelle may have explained, and I can just maybe give some first impressions. And these impressions are coming from certainly one of the smallest missions at the WTO, maybe in fact the smallest mission at the WTO. And I'll be very, very brief, and I will leave more of the technical discussions to the trade experts. My impression in Geneva is that we have some delayed or lowered expectations, given the history of one, the last ministerial conference, which I think by consensus was deemed not to be a success and did not even issue a ministerial statement because there was no agreement. So I think we have some lowered expectations. There's been a pause in the ministerial conferences because of COVID. So in fact, the last ministerial conference was in 2017. And perhaps the last successful ministerial conference was 2 years before that. So I think because of these developments, perhaps many delegations have lowered their expectations about what is possible at MC12. And we have, I think, some issues where many of the delegations, just a few days out from COVID, from MC12, are still very far apart on some of the major issues. I think this has affected the flavor of the upcoming MC12. And when ministers arrive, they will have to very quickly trim back their expectations or be prepared to make adjustments to their positions to allow a consensus to be achieved. Coming from the OECS mission, of course, we are very small. In fact, you're looking at the entire mission right here on your screen. And I think this by itself presents some special challenges. Many of the meetings that we would wish to follow occur concurrently. And it's very difficult with a small mission to be able to cover what you wish to cover in an appropriate fashion. So all these are some of the constraining factors, I believe. At the other end of the scale, you have big missions with many experts covering all the subject matters. And if there's a mission that does not have an expert, well, they fly one in to speak on a subject for half an hour and then fly them back out. So I think we can see at both ends of the spectrum the challenges that small missions are faced with, and what are some of the background atmospherics, I think, for MC12. And of course, having said all that, I will subject myself to correction by ambassadors who have been here for a longer period, including my colleague, Ambassador Blackman, and my predecessor in office, Ambassador Fevrier. So having said all that, I turn the floor back over to Joelle.
And thank you very much, Ambassador Murdoch. And I will now hand you over to Alicia Nichols, my friend and also former MITP Masters in International Trade Policy cohort member, cohort 6. Alicia, it's my pleasure to hand the floor to you to give remarks on behalf of the Sridhar Ramphal Center.
Thank you so much, Joelle, and good day, everyone. My name is Alicia Nichols, part of the trade research team here at the Sridhar Ramphal Center for International Trade Law, Policy and Services of the University of the West Indies, Cayfield campus here in beautiful Barbados. On behalf of the SRC, it is my pleasant task to welcome you to the second in our two-part special SRC Lunchtime Chat series entitled Road to MC12. We're delighted to be co-hosting this timely series with the Geneva mission of the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States, represented here by Mr. Joel Richards, Senior Technical Specialist Trade, and today's esteemed moderator, and as you heard, a friend of mine, and also a fellow trade colleague. As the leading trade policy teaching, research, and outreach center here in the Caribbean region, the SRC seeks to work with relevant and interested parties in hosting events on contemporary issues of trade germane to Caribbean development. And today's continued partnership with the OECS exemplifies this. As you know, on November the 30th to December the 3rd, the World Trade Organization's Ministerial Conference will meet for the first time since December 2017. And MC12 will be held in Geneva, but co-hosted by Kazakhstan, which was originally scheduled to host the conference physically in June 2020. Of course, it was postponed due to the COVID-19 pandemic, which has regrettably to date claimed over 5 million human lives globally, disrupted global supply chains, global trade and FDI flows, and reset the development clocks of many countries. MC12 also falls against the backdrop of mixed reviews on the outcome of the recently concluded United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change's 26th Conference of the Parties in Glasgow, worsening natural disasters, and another stern warning by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that the world is on track to realize global average temperature increases, which exceed the Paris Agreement goal of 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, if countries' climate ambition and action do not match the escalating climate emergency. And let's also not forget the alarming levels of plastic pollution in our oceans, harming marine life and threatening human health. As such, whereas the first webinar in our series addressed the WTO's legacy issues, today's panel of distinguished experts will unpack these newer issues, which increasingly touch on concern trade. These include the environment, public health, and the Joint Statement Initiative discussions on issues such as investment facilitation for development, electronic commerce, and unfortunately, whose legitimacy has been subjected to challenge by some members. Our distinguished panel of speakers are all experts and practitioners on the front lines of these issues and have much to say. So we wish to leave ample time for you, the audience, to engage our speakers. And as such, I'll end my opening comments here. It is my pleasure now to hand you back over to Mr. Richards, our moderator for today's event, who would now introduce our esteemed panel. Thank you so much, Joel. Always a pleasure.
And thank you very much, Alicia, for giving us that very thorough overview. It is now my pleasure to introduce the panel. And we have Ambassador Chad Blackman, former Ambassador Stephen Fevrier, Mr. Odell Cunningham, and Caroline Birkbeck. All very experienced, all very familiar with the MC12 situation here in Geneva and all of the various issues before us today. I'm going to ask first Ambassador Chad Blackman to present, and I will just give a very quick introduction. I think Ambassador Blackman is well known to most of you, but just to let you know that His Excellency Chad Blackman is Barbados's Ambassador and Permanent Representative to the United Nations Office in Geneva. Ambassador Blackman is also Barbados's Ambassador to the Republic of Serbia and to Austria. In a previous life, Ambassador Blackman was a youth development specialist with the Commonwealth, a consulting attorney with Fran Hendy Attorneys, and a senior partner with Global Partners International. Ambassador Blackman holds an LLB in law and an LLM in international trade law from the University of Sussex. Ambassador Blackman, I'm giving you the floor. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Joelle, for your introduction and for the avoidance of any bad feelings to my alumni. It's actually University of Essex. There's a huge rivalry between Sussex and Essex, so those who may hear this may not forgive me if I don't correct it. So thank you very much for that. No, it's okay, it's okay. But thank you very much for, first of all, the invitation, Joelle, and to the OECS mission. And let me say at the onset, you were right in your introduction that Ambassador Murdoch has hit the ground running. Within his first week, I think I had seen him at least 4 to 5 different meetings in 4 to 5 different contexts, making heavy intervention. And truly, the OECS is well represented, as always, following in the good footsteps of former Ambassador Fevrier, who is now the advisor to the WTO's DG. So the OECS is well represented in Geneva, as always, and I look forward to continuing to work with them. But more importantly, to set the context and to go a bit further, this ministerial is unlike any other in recent history, or dare I say, in the history of the WTO's 25-year existence. Yes, every couple of years, there's a ministerial where the ministers reaffirm or affirm rather things brought from the General Council on different areas to approve and for the next working cycle of the organization. But not to go into too much detail now on that, because of course, those are the issues that are already ventilated. The organization, as I said, at a crossroad. The issue of the appellate body still remains. There's still this lingering mindset and debate going on with the Doha development agenda from long ago. But equally, we're in the midst of a pandemic, and we've seen all too well the implications of member states in the organization taking unilateral measures vis-a-vis export restrictions. And also then how does the organization respond to the pandemic? We have issues of discussion relative to the waivers, the TRIPS waivers, very contentious issue, very relevant. And how do we find middle ground on that? But then there are also some issues that are very close to home for us in the Caribbean relative to issues of the environment. And I'm glad that this discussion is taking place in that context. So permit me, Chair, to go more on that side of it. And I would perhaps leave the other panelists to treat to such. Now, I will speak very specifically to the informal dialogue on plastics pollution and environmentally sustainable plastics trade, commonly known as the IDP. So what is it? The IDP invariably is a forum conceptualized to explore how the WTO can contribute to efforts to reduce plastics pollution and promote the transition to a more environmentally sustainable trade in plastics. It started in November last year, 2020, with 7 co-sponsors, and as of today, it has surpassed the 60-member mark. 5 of the 6 coordinators of the IDP, which are Barbados, Fiji, China, Ecuador, and Morocco, are developing countries. So it's a developing country-led initiative. That's something that I really want to put there. And I think that it is noteworthy a feature of the initiative. In fact, over the last hour, we were delighted to welcome Suriname and Chile as the newest co-sponsors of the initiative. And from a CARICOM perspective, of course, you have Barbados, you have Jamaica, you have Belize, and you have Suriname. We're hopeful that other members within our region will also come on board. Now, in addition to the WTO members, the IDP also includes a number of other stakeholders, including UNEP, the World Bank, the Secretariat of the Basel, Rotterdam, and Stockholm Conventions, UNCTAD, and the World Customs Organization. Since it was initiated in the IDP, it has engaged in thematic discussions on, firstly, improving transparency and monitoring trade trends, promoting best practices, strengthening policy coherence, the identification of the scope for collective approaches, assessing capacity and technical assistance needs, and cooperation with other international processes and efforts. Now, the initiative has advanced with development in mind and therefore recognizes the impact that plastic pollution has on economies and the environment, particularly as it relates to LDCs and smaller and developing states like ours in our region. It specifically speaks to the need to address trade-related capacity building and technical assistance needs of developing members, again, with special emphasis on LDCs and vulnerable smaller and developing states. It also provides an opportunity for developing countries, particularly least developed countries, who incidentally are amongst those that are most impacted by plastics pollution participation, and to ensure that their interests are adequately included in the discussions on a matter that relates to their sustainable development. It also allows for these countries to get a better handle on the issues of plastics pollution and environmentally sustainable plastics trade, and provides the opportunity for advocacy with a number of like-minded members to have their specific issues taken forward. Now, the ministers of the IDP will launch a ministerial statement in the margins of the 12th ministerial on the 1st of December. This will be during a joint event with the proponents of the ministerial statements on the trade and environmental sustainability structure discussions, another initiative, and fossil fuel subsidy reform. As you may be aware, Barbados' Minister of Foreign Affairs and Foreign Trade, Senator Dr. the Honorable Jerome Walker, will be one of the 3 vice chairs of the upcoming WTO ministerial here in Geneva. In light of his facilitative role in the conference, I will not speak to our national priorities. Instead, I would speak to some of the priorities from a CARICOM perspective in light of my role as the current coordinator for CARICOM here in Geneva. There's a primacy in reaffirming multilateralism and the multilateral trading system. There's no secret, certainly, that over the last 3-4 years, there has been a retreat in many quarters within the organization from that multilateral approach. Particularly, let's focus a bit and shift in the light of the emergence of the plurilateral or joint initiatives in the WTO. Now, I stick a pin there because, yes, in one hand, there is a retreat from the multilateral approach on a bilateral basis for many countries. But within the organization, there's still a plurilateral approach taking place, which is completely different to the ethos of some countries going in a unilateral basis. So I just wanted to make that distinction very clear. Consensus continues to be a core principle within the WTO. However, and a big however, one of the reasons why the GSIs exist is simply because there could be no consensus amongst WTO members to discuss certain issues, both new issues and old issues, within the multilateral framework of the organization. Now, some countries have therefore broached a discussion regarding the legal status of the GSIs and their outcomes. This ministerial will be a crucial opportunity for WTO members to reaffirm the tenets of multilateralism and consensus. It is also hoped that we can not only reach consensus to reaffirm the inclusive, transparent, and equitable rules-based multilateral trading system and agree on a consensual outcome document, which of course allows ministers to provide welcome guidance on a number of areas in the organization, including, but not limited to, WTO reform, as I mentioned earlier, and also the reinvigoration of the two-tiered dispute settlement system, given that the appellate body has been in abeyance since December 2019. So we're on the eve of the 2-year anniversary of its coming to cease in its previous form. Now, a core issue for the region, and I really want for the audience to think about this. The core issue for the region is the conclusion of a fisheries subsidies agreement in line with the SDG 14.6, a key part of which is special and differential treatment in the form of a de minimis for small players. There is agreement on the need for the WTO to deliver an outcome on the WTO's response to the pandemic. The issue, however, is tied to ensuring that the interests of all members are incorporated in the discussions and outcome on this file, including on the issue of intellectual property rights. This continues to be a big talking point and issue in the organization, as I mentioned earlier. As small economies that have been hard hit by the pandemic, particularly for an economic perspective, we will need to ensure that any outcome also safeguards our interests. And finally, ladies and gentlemen, the issue of WTO reform is one area in which we as CARICOM countries, and more generally, developing countries within the WTO, have a specific interest in. One of our concerns has been an attempt by some developed countries at differentiation among developing countries through the introduction of per capita income criteria for accessing capital, for accessing special and differential treatment and some aspects of technical assistance and capacity building. This is an issue that the small and developing states, largely owing to their smallness and high vulnerability to economic and environmental shocks, have been particularly vocal on rejecting. What is clear is that over the next few days, pragmatism and political will be core to assessing what can be achieved by our ministers at MC12. Certainly, as members of the WTO, we will seek to play our part in ensuring the success of this conference. And dare I say that in the next coming days and perhaps week and a half, I'm sure there will be a lot to discuss and pull apart. And it will be very good to see further engagement where possible from the Sridhar Ramphal Center, even though you'll be at a distance, but technology allows for such. Because there's a lot to unpack, and I think there is also an advocacy role that you can play now in this very important ministerial to guiding the public as to what will be taking place, not just pre-conference as you're doing now, but post-conference, during conference, and post-conference as well, because there's a lot of rich intellectual debates taking place. And I think our region stands to benefit from the intellectual capacity that you also have. So once again, thanks to the OACS mission, Ambassador Murdoch, Joelle, thank you very much, and to the SRC. Good afternoon.
Much, Ambassador Blackman. And just to show you and the audience that we will be having a third webinar in this series, which will be coming post MC12. And we're hoping that some of that intellectual muscle that you rightly said is available within the SRC and also across the region as well, that we'll be tapping into that kind of intellect to dissect what we would have been able to achieve at MC12. And we're hoping that it's something successful. And you made mention of pragmatism. That is going to be essential in not just next week, but there's still so many issues which are yet to be resolved heading into the ministerial. And so that's definitely something that delegations here are going to have to bring to the table as well. I know you have to leave shortly, Ambassador Blackman, and so I'm going to take this opportunity to thank you while you're still on screen for your time, but also for your very sober reflections in terms of the state of play here in Geneva, not just with respect to plastics pollution, but with respect to so many of the other issues that are on the agenda going into the ministerial. And you mentioned the issue of the joint statement initiatives and some of the legal issues surrounding those. And we're hoping to tease those out a bit more when Odell does his presentation, as well as when we take questions from the floor. I will now go very quickly to Mr. Stephen Fevrier. And Stephen is the Senior Advisor to the Director General and the Cabinet of the Director General of the World Trade Organization. Prior to this, Stephen was the Ambassador and Permanent Observer of the OECS to the United Nations Office in Geneva. He also served as the Commonwealth's Regional Trade Policy Advisor in the Pacific, as well as the Commonwealth's Trade Advisor here in Geneva prior to his stint with us as Ambassador of the OECS. Mr. Fevrier holds a Bachelor of Laws from the University of London, an LLM from the University of Westminster, and a Bachelor of Science in Political Science and International Relations from Western University in Canada. And I hope I got those right and that I did not give to your rivals what is due to your right universities. Thank you, Stephen. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Joelle. Yes, you indeed got the universities and the bio correct. Let me first of all say it is really and truly an honor to share this panel with such a distinguished and illustrious group of international trade policy professionals. Again, welcome Ambassador Murdoch, and confirm that indeed your presence in Geneva in short order is being felt and registered. Let me take the opportunity as well to thank Ambassador Blackman for his very sober reflections, as well as Dr. Remy for facilitating this discussion, and to, of course, Joelle, as well as to Alicia for the effective moderation. I've decided to provide you with some clear notes given the sensitivity of the negotiations. I thought it would be better to share some prepared thoughts with you to ensure that I am conveying the message which I think is consistent with where we are. So first of all, we are only 4 days away from the ministerial, which is due to begin on the actively engaged in the negotiations aimed at delivering on issues of common concern. The WTO has a very important role to play in responding to some of the key development challenges of our time. And of course, providing a WTO response to the pandemic is one, taking decisive action to preserve the sustainability of our fish stocks and supporting inclusive, sustainable development areas that we expect and hope the WTO to deliver on at MC12. Allow me to share a few further observations on where we are on some of the key negotiating issues. A response to the pandemic must remain a central issue at the forthcoming ministerial. Members are, of course, working intensively to help address the health and economic fallout of the crisis. Ambassador David Walker of New Zealand, who concluded his work as the facilitator on this file, provided very able facilitation and leadership, and has delivered a draft, a ministerial declaration covering areas where the WTO can make a real difference in responding to the pandemic. This includes in areas of transparency and monitoring, export restrictions, trade facilitation, regulatory cooperation and coherence, of course, and tariffs, supporting inclusive recovery and resilience, the role of trade in services, cooperation with other international organizations, and finally, a framework for future preparedness. There is also a proposal on the establishment of a work plan on pandemic preparedness and resilience, really aimed at enhancing future preparedness for and from future such health crises. The Director General is really acutely aware of the health and economic impacts of the crisis, particularly in CARICOM, and is urging continued constructive efforts to unlock a declaration and a work program at MC12. Another important aspect related to pandemic response is, of course, and Ambassador Murdoch and Blackman have alluded to it, is the TRIPS waiver. While many members have really demonstrated a willingness to explore options to reach a balanced outcome, there is quite a bit of work which remains outstanding if we are to close the remaining gaps. Many members are calling for more equitable access and supply, and an outcome on the TRIPS waiver may really assist in addressing some supply-related concerns. Some members are also exploring actively solutions outside of the TRIPS waiver. Moving now to fishery subsidies, the chair of the negotiating group on rules is now working on a revised text, which should be issued very soon. Members have been engaged in intensive clause-by-clause discussions over the past weeks. Now appears really that members are making a genuine effort to move the discussions forward and are now more closely focused on their own issues, which is a positive development. 3 friends of the chair, Canada, Singapore, and Botswana, have been invited to support and advance the work of the chair and have been giving their very best efforts to bridge the remaining gaps. Ambassador Santiago Wills of Colombia, the chair of the negotiating group, has made it very clear that his expectation is to follow the instruction given to ambassadors by ministers at the 15th of July ministerial to present a clean text ahead of MC12. While it is expected that the chair will be presenting a revised text later today, members will remain engaged in the hope of building further momentum towards a constructive and strong outcome. With respect to the agriculture negotiations, the chair of the negotiating group on agriculture and special session, Ambassador Gloria Peralta of Costa Rica, is continuing intensified consultations with members in different configurations. While there is a clear and demonstrated willingness from the entire membership to achieve something in agriculture, the sequence and ambition levels vary. Members are, however, working hard and intensively to bridge the remaining gaps. Before I conclude, let me also mention the chairman of the General Council, Ambassador Dacio Castillo, has been working very closely with group coordinators on an MC12 outcome document, which will be placed before ministers at the forthcoming ministerial conference. Finally, and of course, Caroline and Chad, of course, alluded to this, a number of new issues are being discussed by proponents. These include a joint ministerial declaration on the advancement of gender equality and women's economic empowerment within trade, a ministerial declaration on MISMEs, a ministerial declaration on services domestic regulation, a joint ministerial statement on investment facilitation for development, and 2 ministerial statements focused on environment, the one being the trade and environmental sustainability structure discussions, and the other, of course, the informal dialogue on plastic pollution and environmentally sustainable plastic trade, IDP. I think it's no surprise to us that Ambassador Blackman has been one of the leading proponents on the issue of plastic pollution and has been extremely active in Geneva to address matters related to plastic pollution. Of course, among many other files that Ambassador Blackman is currently carrying. Let me close by thanking the Sridham Rampal Center and specifically your director, Dr. Remy, for the outstanding work that you are doing in this area. And I look forward to continuing the dialogue at the next appropriate and available time. Let me thank you.
Mr. Fevrier, thank you so very much for your very concise and very comprehensive presentation as well. And I'm seeing comments in the chat asking if it would be possible to share with participants after, and I will be seeking your permission to do that, assuming that would be okay. And you did mention the MC12 outcome document, which delegations are still negotiating on. And I believe that we will indeed have an outcome document at MC12. And that actually places us in a much better position than MC11, because at MC11, you will recall that our ministers weren't even able to agree on a single outcome statement, outcome document. And I think the fact that we are at this advanced stage in the process here in Geneva leading up to MC12 suggests that things are not as bad as they used to be, even though they can be much better. I am now going to turn to Dr. Carolyn Birkbeck, who is going to take us through the trade and environmental sustainability structured discussions. And I think we're doing very well for time because I want to leave enough time for questions and answers later. But just to say very quickly that Dr. Birkbeck is the director of the Forum on Trade, Environment, and the Sustainable Development Goals, and senior researcher at the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies here in Geneva. Dr. Birkbeck had a long career as a senior research associate at the University of Oxford. She was an associate fellow at Hoffman Center for Sustainable Resource Economy and also a consultant at the United Nations Environment Program. Dr. Birkbeck holds a BSc in economics from the University of Sydney in Australia, MA in international relations with distinction from the Johns Hopkins University, and a Doctor of Philosophy in international relations from the University of Oxford. And I hope it's Oxford and not Cambridge, Dr. Birkbeck. I hope I got that one right. The floor is yours.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for the very kind introduction. And luckily I'm Australian and I think we're very relaxed about these matters. So thank you very much for the introduction. So it's my pleasure to be here, and thank you also for the invitation to the OECS and SRC. I'm hoping today just to share some updates on what is happening in Geneva around the environment and environment initiatives. Ambassador Blackman has already highlighted several of these, the plastic pollution one, so I won't spend too much time on that. But I did think it's important just to begin by saying that we have this tension at the moment at the WTO, as I think Ambassador Blackman and Ambassador Murdoch outlined, that we have this overarching desire to be fostering more multilateral approaches to issues of trade. I think for small states, of course, multilateral approaches are particularly important. In fact, with my colleague, Emily Jones, we were commissioned, well, it must be 10 years ago, to write a book for the Commonwealth Secretariat on small states and international trade negotiations and looking at the challenges that they face. But in that book, and you're all aware, the key point is that multilateral approaches are ones that best protect small states from power plays and other challenges. However, it's also really burdensome to participate. So I say this in the context of these environment initiatives because, of course, they add to the load of topics for delegations to cover, and often delegations that have very limited capacity, certainly in Geneva and also back home, as Ambassador Murdoch said, just to follow the sheer volume of meetings and so on. On the other hand, at the moment, we know that the environment is of critical importance to the economies of many small states, particularly small island developing states and vulnerable economies. It's very difficult to participate in trade when you're subject to a series of natural disasters, climate impacts, and other plastic pollution and other environmental challenges. And also, small states face a range of trade measures and trade-related actions taken on by larger countries, ostensibly to advance environmental goals, but not always just environmental goals. So it's this complex arena that, at least in my mind, the environment issue is here to stay on the trade agenda, and the question is how to tackle it from 2 points of view, both so that the way we address the nexus of environment and trade, or climate and trade, is fair and transparent and inclusive, and that it delivers the outcomes that we all need to see. And at the same time that it addresses the very particular needs that small states and vulnerable economies have in this discussion. So a good example there is that if we have a discussion on climate and trade, it's not only about climate mitigation and trade, but also about climate adaptation and trade, for instance. So that, just by way of general introduction, I would just turn quickly to the state of play. So in terms of MC12, there are 5 items that I'm aware of on the agenda. The first is the ministerial, on the environment agenda, is the ministerial outcome document. And here there are negotiations ongoing about what this famous paragraph will look like in the ministerial outcome document. As you can imagine, there are varying degrees of ambition as to what should be included, but there are efforts to make sure that issues of climate, the outcomes of COP26 are mentioned in this ministerial outcome statement, but mentioned in a way that addresses the interests of diversity of the membership, which of course is very tough. And also, I believe that the draft statement at the moment emphasizes the importance of multilateral approaches to environment and trade issues and the role of the CTE, and also the importance of assistance to developing countries, including through aid for trade. But as I said, I haven't seen the final version, but this is something that's very much under discussion. And I think something that Caribbean countries may wish to weigh in on to ensure that to the extent that particularly there are climate issues that you want to see noted in that statement, that they're there. It would be the first time ever that any ministerial outcome document from the WTO has mentioned the word climate, which, you know, I think it would be important just to make sure that the organization looks like it's aware of one of the key global challenges of our time. Ambassador Blackman's talked about fisheries subsidy reform, and so did Stephen, so I won't go over that. So I'm going to just focus on these three initiatives. And the key point to make is that there are new opportunities to address the trade aspects of environmental challenges in the trade system, both through these multilateral avenues, like strengthening the Committee on Trade and Environment, but also through the participation in the joint initiatives. And so the question is what kind of opportunities could these offer for Caribbean regions? I mean, also what challenges could they bring? One thing I did want to say about the joint initiatives is there's really sort of apples and oranges. Some of these are very much around creating new negotiations and new rules or commitments among a subgroup of countries. And some of them are quite happy to sort of go ahead with the subgroup of countries. Others, like the joint initiative on gender and on MSMEs and the IDP, are really more around fostering dialogue, voluntary action, trying to build a sort of collective will to better understand and to find ways forward on issues. So that, just to say that they have quite different, I think in my mind, they have different implications how one also thinks about their legality, because in some respects, some of them are just trying to foster and catalyze a dialogue that could well go forward into multilateral processes, but they're not really trying to stimulate their own set of negotiations per se that would threaten the wider multilateral system. So just a quick point here to say that this is just a very brief map of all of the bodies in the WTO, and just a point to make here is that environment issues actually arise in all of these bodies in different ways. They come up in discussion, presentations or interventions from states and so on. The key one, of course, is up there on the far left, the CTE. But then recently we have these member-led plurilateral initiatives. So there's the TESD and the Informal Dialogue, which are serviced by the Trade and Environment Division, but they're not officially sort of projects of the CTE per se. So on plastic pollution, the key point, one of the motivations for the work on plastic pollution is that waste trade is just part of the plastic pollution problem. We have trade across the life cycle of plastic, and a huge amount of it is in final manufactured plastic products. And the point we made in a recent study with UNCTAD is that this only captures a fraction of the actual trade in plastic that flows across borders, because there are millions of additional tons of plastics that are hidden, embedded in products like phones, TVs, and so on, that are wrapped, that are associated with products through packaging, like all of the pre-packaged food and so on, and that are used in transportation. So if you're a Caribbean country, the concern may not be about importing plastic waste, it will be about importing products that become part of the waste stream that you have to manage. Now, some of these may be vital for national development, for key industries that you have nationally, or even for using in re-exported in other industries that you have. But there's a portion of that which is simply used once or is unnecessary, or for which you may have substitutes at the national level or could develop substitutes at the national level. So that's one of the key issues here. Now, many countries have also been taking more trade-related measures to address aspects of plastic pollution. And here's a list of some of those in Latin America and the Caribbean. So you see there have been some bans on the import and distribution and sale of plastic bags, as well as styrofoam and other very specific products. So a particular problem in the SIDS is that in the Caribbean is a limited capacity to manage this waste and the waste generated by imported products. There's also a trade-related challenges that some countries are also using plastic packaging to add value to their exports of fruit and vegetables. So it's not as simple just to say as we want to get rid of plastic, it may be vital to value added in your supply chains. But efforts to curb plastic pollution could also stimulate exports of substitutes for some countries, special natural fiber-based products that can replace plastic, for instance. And there's also quite some scope for regional approaches. So as I'll try and be super quick because I'm taking too long. As Ambassador Blackman mentioned, we had this informal dialogue. At the moment, there are 62 co-sponsors of the ministerial statement. And I've highlighted in blue here that are islands from around the world. We have Barbados, Cabo Verde, Fiji, Jamaica, and Vanuatu. To my mind, it would be just fantastic if we had more small island developing states join these initiatives. Ambassador Blackman has showed extraordinary leadership in promoting this initiative. And I think it's something that would be potentially of great interest. In the statement itself, there's quite a lot of emphasis on the particular impacts on small island developing states and their vulnerability in this respect and challenges they face. In terms of the actions, one of the specific one is to address trade-related capacity building and technical assistance needs of developing members, in particular LDCs and vulnerable SIDS. And there's also focus on aid for trade. I will skip through. This is just excerpts from the actual statement. I'd be happy to share this afterwards. But one of the third areas that the statement proposes work is to identify best practices and share experiences on how trade cooperation could support efforts to reduce unnecessary or harmful plastic products, with special attention to issues and challenges arising for developing members. And then the last thing is also looking for ways to promote trading goods and services that could reduce plastic pollution. And here again, there's a focus on identifying technologies for effective and sustainable substitutes that are of interest to developing members, including SIDS and their MSMEs. So I think there's quite a lot of effort in that statement to try and ensure that the interests of SIDS and SVEs are really central. I mean, I think they're at the front line of the plastic pollution crisis, and it would send a great signal if there were more Caribbean countries joining the Pacific countries and others on these initiatives. So super quickly on Test D, this is the structured discussions on trade and environmental sustainability. It's co-sponsored so far by 57 members, and I put a link there to the website. The idea is that it's trying to catalyze discussions that have been really hard to have in the formal committees of the WTO. And Ambassador Blackman alluded to this at the beginning, that the challenge is, whilst multilateralism might be the preferred option, in reality, there are countries that don't want to discuss certain issues. So on issues like climate and trade that are really central to SIDS, for instance, you have countries like Russia and Saudi Arabia and Turkey saying they don't want to discuss these issues in the WTO context and they should be discussed elsewhere. Now, they may well need to be discussed elsewhere as well, but I think there's a case for tackling and discussing and better understanding trade and climate issues also in the WTO context, and both on the mitigation and the adaptation side. So the idea of the Test D discussions is to try and provide a place that can catalyze and enable dialogue on these topics. It can be a place to identify priorities and challenges, to look at different policy options and strengthen coherence. And here you'll see at the moment that we have, I think it's 10 developing countries that have joined the initiatives and only one small island state so far for the trade and environment structured discussions. They do have, and in their preamble, they have tried to recognize the range of interests of countries. So there are natural disasters, climate change, mitigation and adaptation, sustainable tourism and sustainable oceans, when they're describing the state of play. And in terms of the work going forward, their efforts to identify work on areas of common interest, inclusive and transparent ways. I think the co-sponsors are really open to the idea that subgroups of members may come forward and say, look, here are some top priorities for us. We would like to see a series of working groups or thematic focus on X or Y issue. And I think that there's a lot of openness to the idea that this should be a fora that developing country members embrace as one where their voices can and should be heard, but that involves engagement from developing countries. And if the initiative remains open, so even if countries don't co-sponsor it, any member of the WTO can always participate in those meetings. I think that's that one. And then just finally, the last initiative, which we haven't mentioned so far, is the one on fossil fuel subsidy reform. As you all probably know, in the COP26 context, there was a great debate about this paragraph that talks about the need to phase down fossil fuel subsidies. I've highlighted the final text there, but it was the first time that there's been a recognition of the need to phase down unabated coal power and inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. And so this has given quite some spur to the work of the Friends of Fossil Fuel Subsidies Reform. At MC12, they now have 42 co-sponsors of their statement, and there are 3 small islands on that. Fiji, Tonga, and Vanuatu have joined that effort. And basically their effort is to try to rationalize and phase out inefficient fossil fuel subsidies along a clear timeline. They want to do so in a way that fully takes into account the specific needs and conditions of developing countries and minimize possible adverse impacts on their development, share information and experiences, and promote more transparency and reporting, and then with an eye to concrete options toward MC13. So there's nothing really concrete in terms of commitments or requirements to join that initiative. But of course, those who are most ambitious in it would like to see ambitious and effective disciplines in the long run on fossil fuel subsidies reform. So I think I should leave it there. I've probably spoken for too long, Joel, but I hope that was a useful overview, and look forward to answering any questions.
Thank you very much, Caroline. And I'm sure there are going to be quite a few questions after. I do see some comments in the chat already. Odell, I'm going to hand over to you. Odell Cunningham is a former colleague of mine at the CARICOM Secretariat's Office of Trade Negotiations, and formerly the Caribbean Regional Negotiating Machinery. And Odell is one of the best legal minds that I've had the opportunity to meet and to work with as well. Odell holds an LLB from the University of the West Indies, an LLM in International Trade Law from Essex, and an LLM in European Business Law from Palace University Consortium. So Odell, it's certainly my pleasure to give the floor to you to share your perspectives on the joint statement initiatives on e-commerce and investment facilitation. And I'm going to just remind you to, in terms of, we'll stick within the 10 minutes and have time for questions and answer. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Joelle, for your kind introduction. Good afternoon, ambassadors. Good afternoon, everyone. Now, to understand the joint statement initiatives on e-commerce in particular, we need to first appreciate the important role that e-commerce plays in today's global economy. So some quick statistics from UNCTAD is that the year before COVID-19 started, 2019, UNCTAD estimated that the value of e-commerce was about $26.7 trillion, representing about 30% of GDP. And in breaking down the major strategic players, there are no developing countries benefiting from the e-commerce development, either as at a business-to-business level or a business-to-consumer level. In fact, of the developing countries who are on that listing, China is the only one, and India that features significantly. So it goes to show that the Caribbean, CARICOM countries, whereas you have this global market, we are nowhere near in a position to benefit from the opportunities globally in e-commerce. And our expectation, of course, is that participating in a multilateral framework will bring benefits to the Caribbean region. But the question is, are those benefits going to be realized in a significant manner? Now, the currently negotiations on e-commerce are taking place in the WTO within the framework of the Joint Statement Initiative, or JSI for short. The JSI negotiations were launched in 2019, and this comes against the backdrop that even though at MC2 back in 1998, ministers gave a very strong mandate to establish a comprehensive work program on e-commerce. The work program was perceived as being lagging in many respects, and a group of countries decided to launch an initiative to prioritize their interest in e-commerce. Currently, there are over 86 countries, and I just made a quick note to show you the geographical spread, that there are a lot of Latin American countries, Ecuador, Panama, Mexico, Honduras. There are some African countries, Kenya, Nigeria, some Asian countries. There are, of course, the usual developed country players, the United States, Canada, the EU, but there are no CARICOM countries in this initiative. And reflecting on the lack of developing country participation and recognizing the full steam ahead towards tangible outcomes on e-commerce at MC12, UNCTAD pointed out that developing countries may have to live with the outcomes of the process without having been important parts of setting the normative agenda. And that's an important consideration for CARICOM. So where we are now in the JSI process is we first need to appreciate the various components of an e-commerce ecosystem and then try to link this to the ongoing negotiations to see what the normative framework around these components are going to look like. So I have divided it into two categories. We have our legal infrastructure, which would consist of electronic transactions legislation. How do you create contracts in a digital environment? How do you enforce them across boundaries, transnational rules? Cybersecurity. How do you ensure that consumer trust and safety is enabled? Consumer protection. How do you protect consumers from fraud and deceptive practices? And then you weave that now into the more systemic components of e-commerce, where you are now looking at your physical infrastructure. E-commerce is data-driven. So do you have the physical infrastructure in place, your broadband penetration, for example, which means disciplines on your data providers? Do you have the logistical framework, the distribution networks, which would mean enhanced disciplines on GATS services commitments such as distribution services, courier services, rail and other transport links? Do you have effective payment infrastructure in place to accept e-payments and to ensure that there are non-discriminatory terms of access for foreign e-services, foreign e-payment services providers? Your overall trade infrastructure, do you have an appropriate balance of trade openness reflected in national treatment and market access commitments, balanced against the whole idea of policy flexibility for sectors in your own economy that you would wish to develop appropriately? Are you implementing trade facilitation commitments? And do you subscribe to the principle of open data? Now, when you match the current work going on in the JSI, we recognize that there are disciplines which are developing around all of these systemic components of the work program, of the JSI work program. So most recently, there have been press releases coming out from the WTO indicating that the chairpersons of the various e-commerce small groups within the JSI framework are making significant progress with a view to presenting a strong showing at MC12, which begins on November 30th, and getting strong ministerial guidance as to how the program works forward. So there are clean meaning the parties who are participating are in full agreement on this, subject, of course, to the understanding that the entire negotiating structure is without prejudice. So there are clean texts right now on consumer protection, open government data, unsolicited commercial messages, which we know as spam, e-signatures, and the authentication of electronic contracts. And the fact that these clean texts are emerging is a strong sign of progress being made, but there are many other issues which remain. So some of the big ticket items that the work program will have to tackle in the future will be the scope of market access commitments. And here is where you are now getting into the sensitivity of developing countries. So in the text, there is an indicative schedule of the market access commitments that should be embraced in GATS-linked e-commerce sectors. So for example, computer and related services, advertising services, distribution services, communication services, and telecommunication services. And the expectation is that members are going to literally open their markets. So they would accept no reservations at all. They would have full market access and national treatment commitments, subject, of course, to the ability to take measures of proper prudential regulation and a general regulatory framework. So what the negotiations are trying to do is to set a template that all parties will have very expansive and ambitious commitments. And this is where developing countries such as CARICOM states, who have adopted a more conservative posture in relation to market opening, may have a difficulty, and this may very well explain the CARICOM part in a process they see may impair significantly on the policy flexibility that they have to develop e-commerce within national strategic plans. So the question is, though, on balance, where do we go from here at MC12 to make sure that even though we are not participating in the process does not lead to an outcome that may be inimical to the interest of CARICOM countries and other small states? Here is the reality. I remember Ambassador Blackman said in his presentation that there are questions within the WTO architecture about the legal status of the JSIs. It's not a multilateral process. It's separate from the WTO work program that ministers authorized in 1998. And the question still remains, is it whatever agreement comes out of this, would it be a plurilateral agreement, or will steps be taken to multilateralize the norms coming out of the framework? These are unanswered questions. But the reality is that if you have 86 members, most of which are the major developing country players, and increasingly you have other large developing countries joining, it may very well be a matter of time before developing countries such as CARICOM are coerced into becoming parties and accepting a rules framework. So we need to ensure through active participation, more active engagement, that the interests of CARICOM are reflected. And issues, therefore, that should be on the agenda in both JSIs, both investment facilitation, as well as e-commerce, should be how strong is the development cooperation framework. Currently, the developing cooperation framework being developed or negotiated in the JSI would have two main components. There is a recognition that there is a digital divide. And as long as the digital divide means where are developing countries technologically in terms of their infrastructure and the usage of digital technologies within the country compared to the domestic, compared to a developed country. And Caribbean countries, there is a significant digital divide with our nearest developed country partners, the USA, Canada, the UK, for example. So there is a proposed framework in e-commerce whereby there would be an overall multilateral approach to helping developing countries to bridge the digital divide. The strength of that framework would be of benefit to CARICOM, and CARICOM needs to pay close attention to that. There is also the proposal that developing countries would be able to request targeted technical and development assistance from developed country partners or other countries who are in a position to help them. So it looks like it's a little bit weaker than the TFA framework, where there were specific commitments, and this is of concern. And just to close off, Joelle, the reason it is of specific concern and a matter that ministers should probably look at is that if we go back to MC2 in 1998, ministers in developing the work program said specifically that the work program on e-commerce should take into account the economic, financial, and development needs of developing countries. That was a very strong mandate. And my concern is that that strength of a mandate is not being reflected necessarily in a development-oriented framework, which does not make appropriate carve-outs for the current position of developing countries. And this is why CARICOM needs to let its voice be heard, so that CARICOM can help to articulate and advocate for a stronger development cooperation framework. So hopefully MC12 will deliver tangible outcomes on these important processes. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Odell. And I think the audience would now be able to see why I said what I said when I was introducing you, and certainly a voice of reason and a voice of logic, and very sound intellect as well. So thank you so much, Odell, for your presentation. The floor is now open to the panelists. I did see some questions in the chat, some going back to the panel we had last week as well, from Mr. David Jordan. So David, while the other panelists are thinking about their questions, I'm just trying to go back through some of the questions that you asked. So just give me a second to get to your questions. I think one question you asked was directed at Ambassador Murdoch, and Ambassador Murdoch is going to respond to you in terms of, I believe, I'm just trying to find your question, David. But I think it related to the level of preparation of the OECS for MC12. And so I'm going to allow Ambassador Murdoch to respond to that specific question from David. And David, then I'll try and my best to answer your other question in terms of the some of the priorities for the OECS at MC12. Ambassador Murdoch.
Okay, thanks, Joelle, and thanks for that question. Well, of course, the OECS is intimately related to CARICOM. And I just want to say, first of all, that having come to Geneva, I am just 2 weeks in Geneva. I have found that CARICOM has a very strong team on the ground in Geneva. And I want to commend CARICOM for that. And I want to highlight the roles played by Ambassador Blackman and also by the Ambassador of Jamaica, Chadwick, who in fact chairs the ACP group here in Geneva at this time. OECS, and OECS will be delivering a strong ministerial team here. 5 of the 6 OECS trade ministers will be here in Geneva next week. And I think that reflects a growing interest in trade matters in the OECS. You know, the preparation here in Geneva, of course, is very strongly connected to preparation in capitals. And in capitals, I think even today, we have had a meeting of the COTED. Was it today?
Today and tomorrow.
Today and tomorrow, there's a meeting of the COTED in the region with MC12 on the agenda. And so we have ministers being briefed, and we have positions being developed in the region, in capitals, which will find their way here to Geneva. We have prepared a comprehensive brief, thank you, Joelle, for our ministers here in Geneva. And we have had meetings of the ministers on that brief. We had that meeting last week. And so I think at the level of preparation is significant, and I think it is growing. One of the issues, of course, in any economic union or grouping of states is that when you're negotiating with a third party, sometimes the internal negotiations can be more difficult than your negotiations with the third party, depending on the structure of your economies. And although OECS is an economic union, different economies of the member states have different structures. And that can reflect itself in different positions adopted by member states. But I think there is significant cohesion. I think the OECS has taken significant steps to prepare itself for MC12. And I go back again to the CARICOM team, and we form a part of that. And I think I'm in a good position, having just arrived, to say that it seems to me that the CARICOM team, there's a phrase, punching above your weight. And I think that applies to the CARICOM team and to the OECS. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Murdoch. And just to supplement as well, in addition to the 5 ministers, we'll have a full team of 15 OECS ministers and senior officials who will be on the ground in Geneva for MC12. And that's definitely a sign of the, as Ambassador Murdoch said, the kind of priority that we assign to the work of the WTO. David, you did also ask about the expectation and roles of where the OECS is concerned in MC12. I really want the other panelists to be able to get in. So but just to tell you quickly that there are over 17 perhaps individual subject matters that will be going before ministers at MC12. And I would say that we have an interest in pretty much all of them. There are certain ones such as fisheries subsidies. There are issues of special and differential treatment, issues with respect to the reform of the WTO, more so the reconstitution of the appellate body of the WTO. That is very, very important to us as well. There are issues in agriculture and being able to ensure that we can maintain the flexibilities that we currently have with respect to providing support to our farming communities. There are issues of trade and health, which came out in the previous panel. And of course, very, very important for our ministers and the fact that 5 are coming is that we believe that it's important to be part of that process of providing political stimulus to the work of the World Trade Organization, especially in a context where there is a new Director General who has come in with a significant amount of energy, and she is enjoying a significant amount of political capital as well. And a member of her cabinet is here, and of course he can speak to some of that. But just to say, she's also our Director General, and I think our ministers are very interested in ensuring that the new Director General of the WTO starts off on the front foot with respect to a first ministerial as well. Panelists, I'm not sure if there's anything else you would want to add. I'm not seeing any other specific questions or any requests for the, okay, I'm seeing a question from Elizabeth Morgan. She's indicating that it is very important that there's a successful outcome to MC12. How likely is it that there will be an agreement on fisheries subsidies? Ambassador Blackman mentioned the importance of SDT in this. Mr. February, I'm not sure if I can throw this over to you in terms of what expectations are at the moment where fisheries subsidies are concerned.
Thank you, Joelle, and thank you to the questioner. I think at the moment we have been engaged in quite focused and intense negotiations under the able stewardship of Ambassador Santiago Wills. These negotiations continued through Saturday evening and Sunday, and of course Monday. At the moment, I think there is a sense that most of the key delegations see progress. Many of the gaps which existed before are being bridged. There is positive momentum in the negotiations, and the landing zones, which are critical to find convergence on the text, I think are within sight of the membership. Having said that, we still have quite a bit of work to do, so we can't at this point relieve the pressure. We need to continue working intensively, but ultimately, a decision on an outcome is within the hands of the members. So I would really urge CARICOM, which, as Ambassador Murdoch indicated, is punching above its weight, to really continue to play an active, constructive bridge building role in getting us to yes, as DG would say. So the landing zones are within sight. Members are fully engaged. and it's now time to put our final energy to getting to a final conclusion. So it's within your hands, and whatever the Secretariat can do to support this member-led process, we certainly will avail ourselves to that opportunity.
Thank you very much, Mr. Fevrier. I'm also seeing a question from Dave Kaulesa. Hi, Dave. Good to see that you're on. And this is posed to Odell. And so Odell, Dave is thanking you for your comments. And he thinks that the area of e-commerce needs to be progressed a lot faster as it is here, and cannot wait on any analysis except for how do we in CARICOM assist our MISMEs in particular to get ahead. So Dave is making that nexus between the current discussions and the advancement of our MISMEs. And so Odell, I'm not sure if that you'd want to respond to Dave's specific query.
Thanks, Joel, and thanks, Dave, for your comment. So yes, I'm in agreement that especially in a developing country, micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises are going to be the drivers of your e-commerce. And there is, in fact, a language in the JSIs where the parties would commit in the e-commerce framework to supporting the development of MSMEs. But of course, there are no tangible measures identified so that we can say, even if there is an agreement and CARICOM becomes party to that agreement, then this would translate into tangible support measures for SMEs. The question we are awaiting this fleshing out of a potential lateral or more framework that may or may not have strong development components to it. What is it that we can do in the region to support it? Well, most recently, as you may be aware, there was an OECS study of which I was a part of the consultancy team that looked at recommendations to support MSMEs. So what needs to be done is you need more of these policy-driven measures within CARICOM, where governments are able to support MSME development through appropriate policies to support infrastructure. For example, one of the major concerns of MSMEs in the region in relation to e-commerce is that there are challenges in accessing appropriate payment mechanisms, e-commerce payment mechanisms. There are also logistical challenges. So maybe within the region, we can get support either of our own or with international development partners to put in place proper logistical frameworks, implement WTO trade facilitation commitments, modernize the frameworks for electronic transactions, modernize the frameworks for electronic communications, promote broadband access, promote the development of indigenous payment services providers. So instead of waiting for the multilateral agenda, there is a lot that we can do intra-regionally in tandem with the CARICOM and the OECS work programs, and loop in our international development partners, many of whom are quite willing, the CARICOM Secretariat, for example, to see how they can assist CARICOM in developing this critical part of the e-commerce system. Thank you.
Odell, and I certainly would not want to be the one to impose on the panelists in terms of their time, which we really appreciate. And Caroline, I suspect you may need to get to dinner very soon, seeing that it's almost 7 here in Geneva. So I'm going to hand over to Alicia, who is going to, for about a minute, just to close off and to say thanks on behalf of the SRC. I'm saying my own thanks on behalf of Ambassador Murdoch and the OECS as well. And thank you so much, panelists, for your time, and to the audience as well for this very, very engaging session. We'll be having another one in 2022, and we'll certainly be sending out those invites. Alicia, I'm going to hand over to you very quickly, and then we will end.
Thank you so much, Joelle, and good afternoon again, everyone. On behalf of the SRC, our director, Dr. Remy, it is my pleasant task to give a short vote of thanks. First, let me thank our partners, the OECS, esteemed panelists who took time out of their busy schedules to share expert insights and perspectives, His Excellency Ambassador Chad Blackman, Dr. Caroline Dear Burbeck, Mr. Stephen Favrier, and Mr. Odell Cunningham. A big thank you. Ambassador Colin Murdoch, thank you for joining us and for being willing to share your learning perspectives with us. Mr. Joel Richards, it's always a pleasure, and thank you for your expert moderation of the session. Thanks as well to Mr. Samuel Eugene, our IT support technician, for his unwavering technical support. Thanks as well to the SRC team, and of course to you, the audience, for your engagement and continued support of our work. You'll be able to access the video recording shortly on our SRC YouTube page. Please feel free to follow us on social media platforms and join our mailing list on our SRC website, shridharframfalcenter.com, to keep up to date with our events and work. Thank you very much again, and wishing everyone a great remainder of your afternoon.
Thank you, everybody, and see you
Bye.
soon. Okay, bye-bye.
Thanks so much, everyone. All the best. Thanks again, Sam.